At the edge of the world lies a land defined by ice, isolation, and endurance. This is Greenland. Though politically tied to Denmark, its soul belongs to a people with a completely different ancestry and story. To understand this place, we have to look past the political borders and ask, who really lives here? How did they survive where others perished? And is the name Greenland just a lie or something more? Let's begin. Over tens of thousands of years, people moved back and forth between Northeast Asia and North America, but not across the ocean the way we imagine it today. 30 to 12,000 years ago, during the last ice age, so much water was locked up in continental ice sheets that global sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing a vast stretch of land between Siberia and Alaska, Beringia. For a long window of prehistory, what is now the Bering Strait wasn't a strait at all. It was a cold, wide land corridor that animals and humans could traverse. From those early movements came the first people of the Americas, who would expand and settle on most of the newly discovered continent. Later on, around 5,000 years ago, additional waves of Arctic specialists from Siberia pushed eastward along the top of the world. These weren't farmers marching across open plains. They were maritime hunters, adapted to sea ice, brutal winds, and long winters. At the time, water had flowed back into the land corridor, meaning the only way for them to cross was by boat, using skin-covered vessels. These are the lost people of ice, the Paleo-Inuits. Also called the Arctic small tool tradition, they brought with them their distinctive toolkits and settled along the eastern coast of the Bering Strait in what is now Bristol Bay, Alaska. Paleo-Inuits' toolkit was defined by its precision and portability. It consisted mainly of tiny, finely crafted microblades struck from prepared stone cores, which were inserted into bone, antler, or wood handles to create sharp composite knives and hunting weapons. Small burins were used to carve bone and antler, while delicate projectile points armed darts or spears for hunting seals and caribou. The emphasis was on lightweight, replaceable components, a highly efficient system perfectly suited to mobile groups surviving in the demanding Arctic environment. From Alaska, they continued traveling eastward over centuries, along frozen coasts, across island chains, following caribou migrations and the shifting margins of sea ice. Small bands, light on their feet, carrying finely crafted microblades and bone tools, moved season by season through the vast Arctic archipelago of what is now northern Canada. Their journey was not a single expedition, but a slow frontier pushing forward across the top of the continent until reaching the Nares Strait. This is where Greenland's human story truly begins. Two cultures of Paleo-Inuits stand out in this early wave of Arctic exploration. These were the people archaeologists call the Saqqaq Culture. Around 2500 BC, they entered Greenland from the west, settling south along the more temperate coastal margins. Their arrival marked a profound moment. For the first time in human history, Greenland, one of the last great landmasses on Earth to be inhabited, had permanent human presence. They adapted quickly, hunting seals, fishing Arctic waters, and establishing seasonal camps along fjords and coastal inlets. Their finely made stone tools and mobile lifeways allowed them to endure in a landscape defined by ice, wind, and isolation. Almost simultaneously, another branch reached Greenland's far north. These were the people known as the Indepencence I culture. Moving through the high Arctic islands, they entered from a harsher corridor, settling in the extreme northern reaches of the island. Their environment was more severe, colder, drier, with long stretches of polar darkness. Yet they too carried the Arctic small tool tradition. Compact, efficient technology, perfectly suited to survival at the edge of the inhabitable world. The nearly concurrent arrival of Saqqaq in the south and Indepencence I in the north represents one of the most remarkable episodes of human expansion, though a meeting between the two has yet to be proven. Within a relatively short span of time, small groups of Arctic hunters had traversed thousands of kilometers of some of the most challenging terrain on Earth and established human life at the threshold of the polar ice cap. The people of the Indepencence I culture lived in oval skin-covered tents, low against the Arctic wind. Inside, a stone mid-passage divided the dwelling, with a central hearth that provided warmth and light in the polar cold. They relied mainly on muskoxen and Arctic foxes, using them for food, clothing, and tools. Around 1800 BC, the Indepencence I culture vanished. Many archaeologists believe a shift toward colder climatic conditions may have made life in the high Arctic unsustainable. The Saqqaq culture endured through this colder period. Unlike Indepencence I, they relied heavily on the sea, hunting seals, seabirds, and other marine animals along the coasts. They too lived in oval skin tents and worked silicate slate into finely shaped tools, much like Indepencence I, though some pieces were carefully polished to a smooth finish. Their distinctive toolkit included bifacial weapon points, barons, end and side scrapers, lances, knife blades, and axe blades, a refined expression of the Arctic small tool tradition. After nearly 17 centuries of presence, the Saqqaq culture too disappeared from Greenland's archaeological record. Though it wouldn't be too long before man stepped again on the Arctic island. Around 800 BC, a new wave of immigration reached Greenland. They spread quickly along the west coast, often reoccupying former Saqqaq sites. Known as the Greenlandic Dorset culture, they also pushed north and remained in northeast Greenland, but moved further south along the coasts in search of polynyas, open water areas in the ice, reflecting their strong focus on marine hunting. Their tents were similar to earlier cultures, yet finds of snow knives and sled shoes suggest greater specialization in snow travel. Archaeologists believe that at times the Greenlandic Dorset may have lived in snow-built dwellings, adapting even more closely to the frozen environment. Also known as the early Dorsets, they occupied all of Greenland's coast, showcasing their dominance over the harsh, inhospitable lands. In the 1st century BC, swings between colder and warmer periods affected sea ice, and therefore the animals they relied on. By the time we entered the current era, they had already disappeared. Greenland would stay uninhabited for a long time. It seemed that in this fragile Arctic environment, even small shifts in temperature or sea ice patterns could dramatically alter the availability of game and other resources, meaning that minor climate changes often had enormous impacts on early cultures. The year was 700 AD, and 7 centuries had gone by since anyone stood food on Greenland. But that was about to change. These are the late Dorset people. They entered from the Nares Strait, following the same route as earlier Paleo-Inuit cultures. But unlike them, they remained mostly in the northwest, rarely moving far from their point of arrival. Descended from the Middle Dorset culture of Arctic Canada and Newfoundland, they carried forward a long tradition of Arctic adaptation. The late Dorset were notable for their artistry and architecture. They carved small, detailed figurines from bone, driftwood, and soapstone, depicting tools, animals, and people. These objects served multiple purposes: personal amulets, spiritual items, or toys for children. They also built large stone structures in parallel rows for communal and social gatherings. For everyday living, They maintained practical dwellings, square peat-walled houses in winter, and summer mid-passage tents similar to those of earlier Arctic cultures. A striking aspect of their culture was what they abandoned: the bow drill, the bow and the arrow, tools essential for hunting, cooking, and keeping warm in the high Arctic. This loss marked a major departure from the practices of earlier Paleo-Inuit cultures, reflecting both adaptation and limitation in a challenging environment. Meanwhile, in Norway, a boy was growing up who had no idea he was drifting toward the edge of history. Erik Thorvaldsson, the son of Thorvald Asvaldsson, was born in Rogaland around 950. His childhood did not last long. When Thorvald was banished from Norway for manslaughter, he gathered his family and sailed west into the unknown. Erik was only 10 years old when they left their homeland behind. They settled in Hornstrandir, in the harsh and isolated northwest of Iceland, a land of cliffs, wind, and cold seas. Before the year 970, Thorvald died there, leaving Erik to carve his own fate. After his father's death, Erik married Jodhilde and moved to Hokedale, where he built a farm and tried to establish stability. Erik and Jodhilde had at least 3 children, one of whom would later become the first European to reach North America. Like his father, Erik had striking red hair and a fierce temperament, earning him the nickname Erik the Red. Trouble followed him closely. One day, his slaves accidentally caused a landslide that damaged a neighboring farm. The farm's owners responded by killing the slaves. Erik retaliated, killing them in turn. For this, he was banished from Hokedale. He relocated to Brokey, but peace did not find him there either. A dispute erupted with a man named Thorgest over several high-seat pillars, sacred possessions Erik considered priceless. The conflict escalated until Erik killed 2 of Thorgest's sons. Alliances formed, tensions hardened, violence lingered in the air. In 982, following his father's footsteps, Erik was declared an outlaw and had to exile Iceland for 3 years. At the time, rumors circulated of lands far to the west, glimpsed by sailors but never settled. With exile forcing his hand, Erik chose not to retreat, but to venture outward. He and a small group of followers sailed west to cold, uncharted waters. They eventually sighted land, vast, rugged and rimmed with ice. They explored the southern tip, then pushed north along the western coast, searching for habitable ground. In fjords sheltered from the worst of the ice, they found grazing land and valleys that reminded them of Iceland. For 3 years, they explored and survived. When Erik returned to Iceland after his exile expired, he carried with him a vision and a name. He called the new land Greenland, deliberately choosing something inviting, something hopeful. It was a calculated promise. The strategy worked. In the summer of 985, 25 ships set sail toward this distant frontier. Only 14 survived the journey, but it was enough. The Norse had become a people of Greenland. At the same time, nearly 5,000 kilometers away, another culture was rising in the Arctic, one that would quietly reshape the fate of the North Atlantic. They were the Thule. Emerging from northern Alaska, the Thule people descended from the Berner culture, distinct from the earlier Arctic small tool tradition and the Paleo-Inuits. They were semi-nomadic, resilient, and highly specialized for life in one of the harshest environments on Earth. From Alaska, they began a remarkable eastward migration, moving along the frozen shores of Arctic North America, passing through the Canadian Arctic, reaching Labrador and eventually Greenland around the year 1200. They did not arrive from the south like the Norse. they came from the west. Settling primarily in northwestern Greenland, the Thule brought with them a way of life perfectly tuned to the Arctic. Their survival revolved around whales, especially slow-moving bowhead whales that swam near the surface. Every part of the animal had value. Meat sustained communities through the winter. Blubber burned as oil for heat and light. Bones became tools, frames, and structural supports. Yet they were not limited to whaling. The Thule hunted seals, walrus, caribou, and fish, adapting fluidly to whatever the environment offered. Their technology set them apart. Advanced harpoons made whaling efficient and deadly precise. Large skin boats allowed coordinated hunts in open water. Dog sleds extended their range across sea ice and tundra, giving them access to vast territories. In prime whaling regions, their settlements could include around 20 houses, alongside communal structures used for ceremony and gathering, evidence of stable, organized communities. They were thriving. So much so that the earlier Dorset people found themselves gradually displaced. Competition for resources intensified. Settlement by settlement, Dorset presence diminished. By the 14th century, the Dorset culture had vanished completely from Greenland. As all of this unfolded across the Arctic, the Norse continued to grow on Greenland. Their world was divided into 3 regions along the southwest coast: the vast eastern settlement, the smaller western settlement, and the modest middle settlement. Together, these communities sustained somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 people, a remote European society planted at the very edge of the known world. Their survival depended on adaptation. The economy combined pastoral farming, hunting, and fishing in a delicate balance. Farmers raised cattle, sheep, and goats, relying heavily on dairy products to endure the long winters. Meat was often supplied by the wild, caribou roaming inland and seals along the coast. But Greenland's greatest wealth lay farther north. Each summer, Norse expeditions sailed toward the rich hunting grounds of Disco Bay. There they hunted walruses, narwhals, and even polar bears, harvesting skins, hides, tusks, and ivory. These materials were practical, used for clothing and tools, but they also carried immense economic value. Walrus ivory, in particular, became Greenland's link to Europe, exported across the sea in exchange for goods the colony could not produce itself. Faith was just as important as trade. In 1126, the Roman Catholic Church established a diocese at Garda, where a cathedral rose as a symbol of permanence and belonging within Christian Europe. Archaeological remains of at least 5 churches suggest that Christianity was not a distant institution, but an active and central part of Norse life in Greenland. Politically, the colony remained tied to Scandinavia. In 1261, Greenlanders accepted the authority of the King of Norway while keeping their own laws. During the unions between Norway and Sweden in the 14th century, regular voyages still connected Greenland to the mainland. But by the mid-1300s, signs of decline began to appear. In 1355, an inspection ship confirmed a continuing Norse and Christian presence. Yet by 1369, the vessel that maintained these voyages was lost at sea and never replaced. Contact grew uncertain. The western settlement was likely abandoned before 1400. The Black Death devastated Iceland between 1402 and 1404, though there is no clear evidence it reached Greenland. Still, the silence deepened. The last written record of a Norse Greenlander is a marriage in 1408. After that, references fade. A 1448 letter from Pope Nicholas V suggests clergy were still needed there, but by the mid-15th century, the eastern settlement likely fell quiet. The final mention of a Norse individual appears around the 1540s. The cooling climate during the Little Ice Age, combined with the collapse of the walrus ivory trade, likely sealed their fate. It was also during this colder period that the Thule way of life began to shift. As sea ice expanded and whale populations declined, open water hunting became increasingly difficult. Boats that had once defined their mobility, kayaks and umiaks, were gradually used less in the high Arctic. The hunting season shortened. The sea, once a highway, became a barrier. By around 1600 AD, they had fully abandoned the high Arctic, moving south in search of more stable conditions. Communities that had once been tightly connected across vast distances grew isolated by ice and climate. Yet this transformation ensured their survival. By adapting rather than resisting, the Thule evolved over generations into the Inuit of Greenland, the ancestors of those who inhabit the island today. For the Inuit, stepping away from large-scale whale hunting reshaped their entire way of life. Instead of organizing around massive whaling expeditions, they relied more heavily on seals, caribou, and fish, smaller prey that demanded different strategies and constant movement. Large whaling settlements gradually shrank, breaking into smaller, mobile groups better suited to shifting conditions, and leadership became more decentralized as the powerful whaling captains were no longer essential. Hunting tools and kayaks were refined for agility rather than scale, and improvised shelters became increasingly important, with the use of igloos expanding across the Arctic landscape. In 1721, Danish-Norwegian forces returned to Greenland. Led by the missionary Hans Egit, the expedition set out with a clear purpose: to re-establish contact with the lost Norse settlers and bring them into the Lutheran Reformation. They founded a settlement at Gothab, today known as Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. But the Norse were gone. No farms, no congregations, no descendants waiting to be reclaimed. Instead, Egit and his followers encountered the Inuit, who had long since shaped the island into their own world. This marked the beginning of Greenland's colonial era. The colonial view of the Greenlanders was far from tolerant. They were labeled pagans, their beliefs dismissed as superstition. Missionary work was not always gentle. Threats and coercion accompanied the push toward Christian conversion. Trade, religion, and colonization moved forward together, tightly intertwined. European merchant ships brought manufactured goods and new systems of commerce, but they also carried disease. Epidemics, including smallpox, swept through communities, claiming countless lives. In 1734, the Danish king granted the merchant and landowner Jacob Severin exclusive rights to all trade and navigation in Greenland's colonies. The goal was strategic: cut off Greenlanders from trading with Dutch whalers and secure Danish control over commerce and missionary efforts. Tensions escalated. On June 6, 1739, after an hour under cannon fire from Severin's ships, 4 Dutch whaling vessels surrendered. The ships were seized in what became known as the Battle of Jakobshavn, the first and only naval battle fought over Greenland. Seal hunting remained central to Inuit life. Blubber, along with whale oil, became the primary export commodity, used in Europe for soap production and as fuel for street lamps. Whale baleen, fox and polar bear skins, narwhal tusks, and fish products were also highly valued. Trade operated through exchange: Greenlandic goods for European groceries and supplies. Natural resources soon drew further interest. Coal deposits around Disco Bay and Uummannaq were exploited as early as the 1780s, with summer mining supplying a year's consumption for the colonies. By the 19th century, Greenlanders had begun trading graphite as well. At its peak, nearly 41.4 tons were delivered to trading posts, an equivalent in value to the blubber and skins of more than 16,000 seals. Remote trading posts spread across the coastline, expanding hunting territories in service of commerce. Initially, Danish managers often married Greenlandic women and settled locally. By the late 19th century, many of these posts were overseen by their mixed heritage children, individuals positioned between two cultures. Meanwhile, Europe was in turmoil. By 1807, Napoleon's France had conquered much of the continent. Fearing that the Danish-Norwegian fleet might fall into French hands and threaten Britain, the English launched a preemptive strike. On September 1st, 1807, they attacked Denmark and bombarded Copenhagen for 2 days. The 7-year conflict disrupted Greenland as well. Shipping routes became unstable. Supplies dwindled. Greenlanders lacked gunpowder and ammunition for hunting, and trade nearly collapsed due to the absence of goods. The consequences were severe, contributing to a noticeable population decline. Legally, inequality was clear. Europeans in Greenland were subject to Danish law, but Greenlanders were not initially included within that framework. In 1828, the government extended Danish law to Greenlanders, employed by the Royal Greenland Trading Department, or the Mission, a limited step that reinforced colonial structures rather than dismantling them. Colonization fundamentally reshaped Greenlandic society. Systems built around colonial trade and Christianity left Greenlanders with little influence over political or economic development. In the early 20th century, new economic possibilities emerged. The colonial administration recognized the potential of Greenlandic fisheries, and between 1919 and 1939, 125 fishery stations were established. This marked a profound shift from hunting to fishing. Families moved toward larger colonies. Women entered wage labor through fish processing. Hunters adopted motorboats and rowboats, modernizing their livelihoods. Further south, another transformation took place. In 1915, the administration founded a sheep farming station in Qaqortoq. The industry grew rapidly, expanding from a few hundred sheep in 1915 to around 10,000 by 1936. Population numbers reflected change. West Greenland's population rose from 11,190 in 1901 to 16,970 in 1938. Yet growth came with hardship. Overcrowded housing and poor hygiene fueled the spread of disease, particularly tuberculosis, which accounted for 36% of all deaths during that period. Since 1776, Greenland had remained largely closed to the outside world, shielded from broader global exchange. That isolation limited development, but preserved a degree of separation from European conflicts. That separation would not last. With the outbreak of World War II, Greenland's position in the North Atlantic would once again draw the attention of greater powers, and the island's isolation would be abruptly broken. The Nazi invasion and occupation of Denmark in 1940 abruptly severed Greenland from Danish control and regular supplies. Isolated from Copenhagen, the island suddenly became strategically vital. Both the Allies and Nazi Germany recognized its importance, not only as a potential base in the Battle of the Atlantic, but as a critical source of Arctic weather data that could determine the outcome of naval and aerial operations. Henrik Kaufmann, Denmark's minister to the United States, refused to recognize the German occupation. Acting independently, he signed a treaty with the United States on April 9, 1941, granting permission for American forces to establish military installations in Greenland. 14 American bases were constructed along the west and east coasts. These installations served multiple purposes: ferrying aircraft to Europe, supporting Allied naval patrols, and launching operations against German submarines prowling the North Atlantic. With Denmark under occupation and unable to administer the island effectively, Greenland functioned with an unusual degree of autonomy. Its exports, especially cryolite, essential for aluminum production, further strengthened its strategic value. and American support guaranteed vital supplies. Germany, however, sought its own foothold. Secret weather stations were established in eastern Greenland as part of the North Atlantic Weather War, aiming to secure critical meteorological intelligence. In response, Greenland formed the Sirius Dog Sled Patrol in 1941. Small teams of Greenlanders, traveling by sled across vast frozen distances, located and attacked these stations alongside American naval and air forces. In a series of isolated skirmishes, 1 Dane and 1 German were killed. By 1944, the Germans abandoned their Arctic outposts, leaving Greenland firmly within the Allied sphere. During the Cold War, Greenland once again became strategically critical. Its location gave it control over key routes between Soviet Arctic harbors and the Atlantic Ocean. Even more importantly, it sat directly beneath the projected flight paths of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were expected to pass over the Arctic in the event of nuclear war. Greenland was no longer a distant colony. It was a frontline observation post. The United States even proposed purchasing Greenland, offering Denmark $100 million. Denmark refused. Instead, American presence deepened. Thule Air Base in the northwest was made permanent, anchoring US military operations in the high Arctic. In 1953, several Inuit families were forcibly relocated by Danish authorities to make room for the base's expansion. The displacement left lasting scars and turned Thule into a symbol of tension between the Danish government and the Greenlandic population. Tragedy struck on January 21, 1968, when a US B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed near Thule. The impact scattered radioactive debris across the ice. While most contamination was removed, one of the bombs was never recovered and remains missing. At the same time, rapid urbanization reshaped Greenlandic society. Danish policy encouraged migration from small settlements to larger towns, cutting many villages off from support. Former hunters, once embedded in tight-knit communities, found themselves isolated in unfamiliar urban environments. Social structures fractured, mental health crises intensified, and suicide rates climbed, challenges that continue to affect Greenland today. By 1975, Denmark was subsidizing Greenland with more than $100 million each year. The imbalance between the two societies was still visible. Around 80% of the island's 800 teachers were Danish, while only 1 doctor and 3 lawyers were Greenlandic. Political representation was limited as well. Despite 70% of Greenlanders voting against joining the European Economic Community, Greenland entered in 1973 because Denmark did. Pressure for autonomy grew. In 1978, the Danish parliament approved devolution, and in 1979, Home Rule was introduced under a locally elected Inatsisartut. On 23 February 1982, a narrow majority, 53%, voted to leave the EEC. The withdrawal process concluded in 1985, marking one of the first major assertions of modern Greenlandic self-determination. Home Rule gradually became more Greenlandized. Danish influence was reduced in public life, and regional dialects were standardized under the language and culture of the Kalaallit. In 1979, the capital Gotthab officially became Nuuk. A distinct Greenlandic flag was adopted in 1985. The Royal Greenland Trading Department was replaced in 1986 by the locally administered Kalaallit Nuafi-at. After a referendum in 2008, expanded self-government took effect, and in 2009, Danish was removed as an official language. Greenland's strategic importance, however, never disappeared. In January 2025, shortly after beginning his second presidential term, US President Donald Trump publicly pressured Denmark to sell Greenland to the United States, arguing it was essential for national security and Arctic dominance. Denmark rejected the proposal. The episode reignited global attention on the island, a reminder that Greenland remains central to geopolitical calculations in the Arctic. Greenland today stands at the intersection of Arctic endurance and global attention. From the arrival of the Thule to the rise and disappearance of the Norse, from colonization to self-government, the island's story has been shaped by contact, adaptation, and survival. Modern Greenlanders are primarily Inuit in culture and identity, yet the population reflects centuries of interaction. The region is dominated by Christianity, with 95% of the population practicing evangelical Lutheranism. On average, many Greenlanders carry roughly 25% European ancestry, largely the result of Danish colonial presence, though traces of earlier Norse settlers may also persist. Today, Greenland remains a self-governing nation within the Kingdom of Denmark, navigating autonomy, climate change, and renewed geopolitical interest. Its people embody a layered heritage, Arctic at its core, shaped by history and firmly rooted in the present. Thanks for watching. Dive into more videos on the channel to uncover incredible stories, ancient cities, and fascinating corners of the world. There's always something amazing waiting for you.